All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War. We're very excited tonight to bring to you tonight Dr. Jim Piecuch, a good friend of ours, supporter of a lot of things we do. Jim has authored many books about the American Revolution, many focusing on the Southern campaigns, but others covering the entire war. I'm also joined with my cohort here, Mark Malloy, who has a book coming out on Charleston very soon, right, Mark? A couple weeks, maybe a month. We'll
Already
see.
out. It's already out.
Well, we hope. So anyway, so what we have with us tonight is Jim to talk about the Battle of Waxhaws, and I'm holding one of Jim's books here about Waxhaws. Highly recommend it. It's called "The Blood Be on Your Head: Tarleton and the Myth of Buford's Massacre." So one of the reasons why we wanted to bring Jim on is not just because of the anniversary on May 29th, but so much has been written and said about the massacre there at Waxhaws, or was it a massacre? And when I first started reading about Waxhaws, I was drawn to Jim's book because he likes to tackle a lot of these myths. So Jim, I'm going to have you kind of take over here and tell us a little bit about the Battle of Waxhaws and some of your research and some of your findings.
Okay, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Mark, for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, the Battle of the Waxhaws is one of the most controversial in the American Revolution, perhaps the most controversial. It was quickly labeled a massacre by the Americans with the belief that the American soldiers were killed in the act of surrendering and after surrendering. And this became the accepted narrative for decades, and historians just picked it up and told that story. And of course, what helped tell that story is they had the perfect villain in the person of the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton. Tarleton had been a problem, shall we say, for the Americans throughout the war. He was a young guy in his mid-20s. His parents had sent him to university in London, where he majored in gambling and womanizing. And just before the revolution, they bought him a commission in the Guards, Dragoons, the cavalry unit, as a cornet, the lowest ranking cavalry officer. But when the revolution broke out, Tarleton wanted action, and he volunteered for service in America and started to make a name for himself fairly quickly. In December of 1776, he accompanied the detachment as a volunteer that captured Major General Charles Lee at Basking Ridge, New Jersey. So that was the first time he came to be mentioned. When the British Legion was formed in 1778 from American loyalists, he ended up taking command because the founder, Lord Cathcart, was injured. And he was very effective in two battles, Monk's Corner and Lanew's Ferry, during the siege of Charleston, in really badly defeating, cutting up the American cavalry, putting them out of action for months. The two regiments involved, the Continental Dragoons under William Washington and Anthony Walton White, had to go to North Carolina to recruit and refit because they were so badly beaten. And so he was a very effective commander. And of course, for that reason, the Americans disliked him. With regard to the Battle of the Waxhaws, how it came about, the Virginia regiments from the Continental Army, along with the North Carolina regiments, had been sent by George Washington to reinforce Charleston. And they arrived in the spring of 1780. By this point in the war, most of the Continental regiments were under strength. So the state of Virginia decided to recruit 3 provisional regiments that would then be sent to Charleston to reinforce the main army. Buford's regiment was the first completed, and he set out for Charleston, and actually was on the opposite bank at Lanew's Ferry when Tarleton cut up the American cavalry on the other side of the river, at which point he began retreating. Charleston was already surrounded, and he fell back to Camden with what then was the only remaining Continental unit of any size, really south of Virginia, where those two other regiments were recruiting. Everybody else either captured or up with Washington's army. The Marylanders and Delaware troops were on the way. They had been dispatched in April, but they weren't going to get there for a while. So once the surrender of Charleston was completed and the British began moving across the state of South Carolina and occupying key posts, Lord Cornwallis, who at that point, until June 3rd, he was still second in command to General Henry Clinton. Clinton at that point in early June sailed back to New York, leaving Cornwallis in charge. But Cornwallis told Tarleton to pursue Buford and defeat him or drive him out of the state, because British generals, British officers were aware that, you know, the militia could often get discouraged if they had a continental unit they could rally around. They might be inclined to continue resistance. So Cornwallis wanted Buford beaten or driven out. So Tarleton took off after Buford. Buford, by that time, from Camden, the refugee forces there split up. South Carolina Governor John Rutledge, South Carolina Brigadier General, the Continentals, Isaac Huger, who didn't have any real troops with him, and a few others retreated north directly to Charlotte. Buford took the Waxhaws Road, leading towards the Waxhaws into North Carolina farther east. So Tarleton sets off in pursuit. Eventually, he's going to cover 105 miles, and I'll show you that later, under tough conditions. What's interesting in these narratives is that Tarleton is supposedly taking off. His blood is up. He's ready to kill anybody he comes across. But one of the first challenges to that view I found was in the diary of Joseph Kershaw, who was a revolutionary leader and the big influential person in Camden. And when Tarleton was approaching Camden, Kershaw actually led a delegation south of town with a white flag to surrender. And he talked about that in his diary briefly. His diary is hard to find because it's not under Kershaw. It's in another family collection where it somehow ended up. But he mentions that he surrendered to Tarleton, that Tarleton was very polite and told him to go back and remain peaceably at home, that Cornwallis was coming up behind. And so obviously he didn't strike Kershaw as somebody who was being driven by bloodlust at that time, shortly before the battle. So I'll just start going through some of this about the controversies. I mentioned that the accusation that the British perpetrated a deliberate massacre of troops while they were trying to surrender or who had already been captured. You can see the illustration, which is fanciful, that I have on the right side that we reproduced in the book that Rob showed you, which is the Americans are being overrun and slaughtered next to their artillery piece, which they had but didn't use. And I'll talk about that later. And this battle gave rise to the slogan, Tarleton's Quarter. In the 18th century, to give quarter to an enemy meant to allow them to surrender and treat them as a prisoner of war. Tarleton's Quarter meant to give no quarter, to kill everyone of your enemies. And actually, there was an earlier version in the South, which was used by British and Loyalists, was called a Georgia parole, because Georgia revolutionaries frequently executed their prisoners, particularly Loyalist prisoners who were charged with treason to the state government. But Tarleton's Quarter became a much more popular saying, meant to show no mercy, and it was used to justify subsequent attacks and executions of British and Loyalist prisoners. One of the better known was at Hammond's Store in late December of 1780, when William Washington's cavalry attacked a Loyalist party and cut them to pieces. And they said, you know, we gave them Buford's play, which was another synonym for Tarleton's Quarter. A couple of months earlier at Kings Mountain, after the Loyalists there surrendered, the American militia continued to fire into them, and shouting things like Tarleton's Quarter. What happened at the Waxhaws led to a lot of additional violence and brutality in the South afterwards. So how did the battle play out? Tarleton had his orders to drive out Buford or defeat him. He took off with his British Legion, which consisted of 270 men, cavalry and light infantry. Not all of the 270 made it to the battle. They had a really tough time moving. Sometimes you'd get these downpours and the dirt roads would turn into a quagmire. It would slow people down. The horses were exhausted. They replaced some on the way. Sometimes the light infantry would jog alongside the horsemen holding the saddle stirrup. Other times the men would ride mounted double. He started out with 270 men. This was more than were actually present at the battle. And they had one 3-pounder light artillery piece with them. In addition to the British Legion light infantry and cavalry, they also had a troop of regular Army British cavalry from the 17th Light Dragoons. Interestingly enough, in relation to the battle, the 17th Light Dragoons had served in Europe during the 7 Years' War earlier, and at that time they changed their logo because they had served alongside the Prussian Hussar cavalry. And if you're familiar with the little skulled crossbones that the Prussian Death Head Hussars, and the 17th officers were impressed, so they adopted the skulled crossbones for the helmets on the front of the cavalry helmets. So maybe an unfortunate coincidence here. But Tarleton pushes his men. The Americans had a 10-day head start, counting from when they had retreated from the Santee River at Lanús Ferry. So Buford should have been able to get away, but he didn't. Tarleton's troops traveled 105 miles in 54 hours, which is very impressive to catch Buford. As Tarleton realized he was approaching the Americans, who had 350 infantry in Buford's command in his regiment. They also had some fragments of the Continental Light Dragoons beaten earlier, and some South Carolina militia. They had wagons, they had 2 6-pounder artillery pieces and gunners. They also had a contingent of loyalist prisoners with them, who they were trying to get out of reach of the British. So Tarleton sent an officer forward with a demand that Buford surrender on the same terms as the Charleston garrison, which would have meant that they would have gone into captivity with the other troops in Charleston. The officers would have kept their personal baggage, etc. Buford rejected that surrender demand, and he continued marching until it was clear Tarleton caught him, and then he deployed for battle. Now, what's interesting is that you start seeing very early in these accounts the contradictions. Buford said when he got the surrender demand, he continued marching. He didn't stop for it. He just basically said, no, I'm not going to surrender, and continued his march. Some of the accounts claim that Buford stopped, had called his officers, held a council of war, and they decided that they would continue to fight. But a lot of this is the result of Buford's report, which was written 3 days after the battle and sent to the Virginia Assembly, the legislature, is not in one of the standard collections you would look at. So it's not in the Thomas Jefferson papers or some of these other collections. I found it, and that was, in addition to some of these other little things like the Kershaw Diary that had raised a few doubts about the story, which I had accepted until then. Buford's letter really confirmed to me that this massacre story was wrong, because it's in a private collection. A private collector named Thomas Addis Emmett got a hold of this letter, and he bought all kinds of documents, acquired all kinds of documents from his collection, and it was just in there. And I actually ran across it. I had gone to the New York Public Library doing research because they had some information on Southern loyalists there. and talking with one of them. They said, oh, there's some material in the Emmett collection. It's like, what's the Emmett collection? Now it's actually digitized. So you can go online, just search Thomas Addis Emmett collection. It'll take you to the New York Public Library website, and you can search and read the documents yourself. And I will go into the inconsistencies there. So Buford continued marching. He left a rear guard on a hill. When he stopped, when he realized Tarleton was catching up to him, and then he deployed for battle. The map you see is not quite correct. You can see the road. This was the road the Americans were retreating on. At the top, you see the two artillery pieces. Buford did not deploy his artillery. He continued sending the artillery to retreat. The 2 6-pounders outweighed Tarleton's 1 3-pounder and could have given him some assistance. We were the first, Charles Baxley of Southern Campaigns, the American Revolution, who convinced me to publish this as the small book. We were the first to put the battle on the east side of the road, because everybody based it on the American descriptions, and the Americans are facing the opposite direction. So when they say where they were deployed, everybody had them on the opposite side of the road. And we realized that, no, if you're looking at it, from this, you have to flip it. The only mistake we made in this map, we didn't know it at the time because of the archaeology, the Americans actually extended through and a little bit beyond the road. So there was a short distance on the west side of the road. So they deployed for battle. Tarleton came up. The 4 men in the rear guard were quickly overwhelmed. And then Tarleton began deploying his forces, and he alternated the light infantry with the cavalry. The light infantry was commanded by Major Charles Cochrane of the British Legion. I later found an account of his that he had gone back to Britain, and he was trying to convince British authorities to create a 2nd Battalion of the British Legion. And so he wrote a letter to General Jeffrey Amherst, and he described the Battle of the Waxhaws, which provided more information from an unexpected source. I was reading the Amherst papers on microfilm, and there was not a whole lot. And I said, I don't know if this is going to be worthwhile. And then I found Cochrane's letter. That's probably the best item I found in there. But that also helped to enhance the actual story. So Tarleton comes up. He deploys in alternating form between the cavalry and the infantry. He leaves his 3-pounder. He doesn't use it in the action. He leaves it in a small detachment on top of that hill where the American rear guard was, because he had stragglers still coming up. So he wanted the stragglers to come there and sort of form. And he also intended the stragglers and the artillery piece to be a rally point, that if he was defeated and driven back, they could try to reform and continue resistance there. And defeat is maybe not unlikely when you started out with 270 men. If you lost 10%, you're down to 240, and you're up against 350 infantrymen. You're certainly outnumbered, roughly 3-2. So Tarleton gets his troops into position, and then he orders the attack. They go forward. Tarleton, however, unlike a normal, I don't want to say a normal, but a traditional officer who would have stayed back in the center, maybe even with the artillery piece at a command post to direct and watch the course of the battle, Tarleton joins the British Legion cavalry on his own left flank and rides, when he orders a charge, he rides forward with everybody else. And that, of course, creates some confusion in some of the problems, I believe. Cochrane's account that I found in the Amherst papers is enlightening for a couple of reasons. One, as they were deploying and the light infantry was deploying, he said he overheard some of the Americans saying, "Hey, wait, there's infantry." And another American officer yelled out, "Oh, no, don't worry, it's just dismounted cavalry." And that may be a clue as to why Buford chose to fight. If he thought he was just facing cavalry mounted or dismounted without any infantry, he may have felt his infantry had an edge. Cochrane pointed out that he told his light infantry to fix bayonets and advance, and that they did not fire a shot. The light infantry charged without firing. That's something to keep in mind as we move along. So the British attack and are on the verge of routing the Americans, and the infantry charges with fixed bayonets, the cavalry with their drawn sabers. This is a painting of a British cavalry charge, not at the Waxhaws, but elsewhere, but it gives you an idea. Cavalry charge, except this picture is in column. They're deployed in line of battle. Now, as the British attack gets underway, Buford rethinks his situation and realizes that he probably isn't going to win this one. So he sends somebody, a soldier, an officer, an aide, with a white flag to offer to surrender on the terms Tarleton originally offered. This is where a lot of confusion has arisen over the battle. And this is what convinced me that the accounts were inaccurate, because Buford, in his letter to the Virginia legislature, says clearly, the flag was returned to me and the offer was rudely refused. My surrender offer was refused. That was all he really had to say about the battle, because we know from pension applications of soldiers who were there that as Buford's line was about to be overwhelmed, he decided that the safest maneuver was to turn his horse rearward and apply the spurs and get out. So Buford left the field. So when he describes in his letter that his men were slaughtered, then he wrote that 3 days later. Clearly, he was reporting secondhand information, because his own soldiers who noted his presence on the field, were very clear that he didn't stay around to see what happened. He left as his lines collapsed. Interestingly enough, I was asked to give this version of this talk at Kings Mountain Battlefield Park, outdoors in this amphitheater that they had. And afterwards, people came up to talk to me, and one person said, did you see that woman walk out when you talked about Buford fleeing the field? And I said, no. I said, there were people coming and going. It was a big group. I said, I wasn't really paying attention. And he said, she's a Buford descendant. And said, you really got her mad. I said, well, I'm only saying what the documents say. I'm not the one who dragged Buford from the field and made him run away, but it's pretty clear that he did. So what were the casualties? This would seem to support a massacre theory. The British had only, and we should say British, but in fact, the British Legion was a loyalist unit. The three original cavalry units in the British Legion, for those of you who have a little sense of geography, were the Bucks County Light Dragoons, the Chester County Light Dragoons, and those are right outside where the other Light Dragoon unit came from, the Philadelphia Light Dragoons. They were recruited during the British occupation of Philadelphia. So except for the 17th Light Dragoons, Tarleton's men were loyalists. So 5 of them killed, 12 wounded. They had 11 horses killed and 19 horses wounded. American losses are really high. 113 killed, 150 wounded who were captured, 53 unwounded men who were captured. Tarleton then sent his cavalry up the road, where they captured 4 artillery pieces, including the 2 6-pounders. The other 2 may have been 3-pounders. It's not quite clear what they were. They also took 28 wagons loaded with weapons and other supplies. The militia, the Continental Light Dragoons, scattered when the British Legion cavalry came up after the wagon train. So this is a very significant defeat, and coming on top of the surrender of Charleston just 17 days earlier, the Americans are not in a good position. So if you look at the casualties, you'd say, yeah, it's a massacre, but let's look at the testimony. Here's Buford writing on June 2nd. He said, our loss is very great, and many of which were killed after they laid down their arms. But we know he wasn't there to see it because his own troops testified to that. Major Henry Bauer, or Bouillet, I've heard it pronounced both ways, wrote in 1820, 40 years later, a dreadful massacre of the detachment followed. Bauer also claimed that he carried the white flag. Now remember, Buford said he sent one person with a white flag who returned to him. Bauer's story is a little different. Dr. Robert Brownfield, who wrote an appendix on this for William Doba and James's biography of Francis Marion of 1820, he treated the wounded after. He was a continental doctor, South Carolinian. He said, not a man was spared. They went over the ground plunging bayonets into everyone that exhibited any signs of life. And Brownfield told the story of an ensign Croot who carried the surrender flag. So we've got testimony of a commander who had already left the field and two recountings 40 years after the fact, when the massacre story had been well established, at least in oral terms, one of whom says he carried the white flag for Buford, the other saying that he knew Ensign Croot who carried the flag for Buford. So we get into those a little bit. And as I mentioned, Buford's letter, had generally not even been mentioned. I couldn't find it cited anywhere. At the time I was doing my dissertation research is when I found it. And I was looking at every sources. But the historians after, they had Bauer's account, they had Brownfield's account. Well, here we have eyewitness testimony. Here's our story. But let's look at the evidence. As I mentioned, Buford said he sent a single flag of truce and the bearer returned. It had been rejected. Bauer had a great story. He said that Buford told him, take the flag out and the surrender offer. And Bauer said, I protested because the volleys of musketry being exchanged were so heavy that it would have been too dangerous for me to go out there, but that Buford told him, gave him positive orders to go. Question, what volleys of musketry? British Legion infantry didn't fire. And we know from numerous American accounts that the Americans fired one volley before they were overrun. There was no exchange of musket fire, like Bauer recounts. And he also said that his horse was shot under him. And that I can't read the last time PowerPoint there. You see, I think it says he did not return to Buford, right? He had not returned. So so his horse is shot and he never gets back to Buford. But Buford says the flag bearer came back. Now Brownfield, writing about Ensign John Croot, said that Croot carried the flag, but as he rode forward, he was instantly cut down and never returned to Buford, obviously, if he was cut down while carrying a white flag. But Buford's clear, the flag bearer returned. Some historians tried to reconcile and say, well, Buford sent out one flag and when it miscarried, and then he sent out a second flag, which is fine if you want to, if you take the account saying that neither flag bearer returned. But if you take Buford's account, well, the flag bearer did return. So clearly it's not Croot and it's not Bauer. It sort of reminds me when my father lived to be in his mid-90s, and he served in World War II in North Africa, and later he was reactivated for the Korean War. And he used to tell, he eventually moved into a high-rise housing for the elderly up in New England, and they used to go down for their dinners, and people would ask him about his service, and he ended up, telling them how in the Korean War he had been in Korea, and that when the North Koreans invaded, he was one of the handful of men holding the Pusan perimeter. This dramatic story, and it was a great story. And the only slight problem with it was, as far as I know, the Poussin perimeter was not at an Air National Guard base in Maine, the state of Maine, which is where he actually did his service. But he found he got a lot of attention by embellishing these stories. He talked about, fighting under Patton in North Africa. But he was actually, and I've got the photos and everything too. He was actually assigned with a liaison group to the British headquarters in Cairo. So he wasn't with Patton, but I think there's no harm intended. But a lot of these people, want to sort of embellish their experiences and make themselves seem important and part of a very significant piece of history. But neither account matches what we actually know. We got 40-year-old testimony that just is in conflict with all of the other evidence. So pretty much have to dismiss those. What did contemporaries say on the American side? The British obviously portrayed it as a great victory. Henry Clinton wrote about it to everybody, how they defeated the Continentals. And Henry Clinton was not a hard war, Tarleton type guy. So, but we would expect the British to celebrate it. But here's what some of the Americans said. South Carolina Governor John Rutledge, who had been retreating on the road to Charlotte, said simply, Buford was attacked and totally defeated. William Caswell of North Carolina militia says the whole of Colonel Buford's troops was beaten and taken. Colonel Otho Holland Williams of the Maryland Continentals, well, the troops were effectively routed. None of these people in a position to know and who could, in some cases, benefit from this, talk about a massacre. In memoirs written after the war, Colonel Richard Wynn of the South Carolina Militia, Captain Tarleton Brown of the South Carolina Militia, Colonel William R. Davie of the North Carolina Militia, they wrote accounts after the war, and none of them said anything about a massacre at the Waxhaws. Davies is particularly interesting because he makes no mention or accusation of Tarleton massacring anybody at the Waxhaws, but does accuse Tarleton of massacring some of Sumter's men in August 1780 after defeating Sumter at Fishing Creek. So he's obviously not afraid to talk about a massacre. Now, Henry Lee writes about it in his memoirs, again, 30 plus years after the fact. But again, he wasn't there. He didn't get to the South until 6 months later. So, so by then he's repeating this information. So we don't see any accusations. A person I looked at and found very interesting in terms of his comments was General William Moultrie of the South Carolina Continentals. He was captured at the fall of Charleston, and as the senior officer was commander of the prisoners of war held there. Those 53 prisoners, unwounded, taken at the Waxhaws, went to Charleston, as did the lightly wounded men once they were treated. Incidentally, Tarleton himself sent for doctors from as far away as Camden and Charlotte to treat the American wounded, which doesn't seem consistent with a guy wanting to commit a massacre. I just recently, in relation to another project, coincidentally identified one of these who was from Camden, Dr. Thomas Charlton. He took his medical kit to the Waxhaws and treated the prisoners, and he wrote about that in a letter detailing his service when he was accused of supporting the British for assisting at the Camden Hospital during the British occupation. And he wrote to Nathaniel Greene testifying to his service, and that was one of the things he mentioned, and he didn't say anything about a massacre there either. So Moultrie had access to these prisoners. Clearly, he could have learned more of what happened. He never termed the Waxhaws battle a massacre. Instead, he compared it to several similar engagements that he was aware of in Europe. Moultrie apparently was well-versed in military history. And he said this simply demonstrates the superiority which cavalry have over infantry. That's why the casualties were so one-sided. And Moultrie never, in his discussion, criticized Tarleton for anything. Instead, he went after Buford. Clearly, he believed that Buford mismanaged the operation in the battle, and he went with a whole list of Buford's errors. He said, why didn't he deploy his artillery. He had the 2 6-pounders and 2 other pieces from the list of captured items, but if he had 2 6-pounders there, they could have started bombarding the British while they were deploying. It would possibly have changed the situation. Buford did not order his infantry to fix bayonets. Horses will not, even if their riders are urging them on, horses will not charge into a line of fixed bayonets. They're not going to deliberately impale themselves. Buford never ordered his men to fix bayonets. He also told his troops to hold their fire until the attackers were within 30 yards of their position, which meant what? They could fire 1 volley and they would not have time to reload. And then even if the volley had been more effective, and it wasn't, by the time they would have reloaded, the cavalry was on top of them. The horses had so much momentum that they would have been carried into the lines anyway. A couple of other things he pointed out that I didn't list here. He said, why didn't, in addition to employing his artillery, didn't he use the wagons to put in front of his troops as a sort of fortification? That would have interfered with the British attack and probably checked it. You got 28 wagons with 2 artillery pieces and men behind them. That would have been basically the equivalent of an entrenched position. Another element that he pointed out, and I'm not aware that it was ever done in America during the Revolution, but many people might be familiar with it from the Napoleonic Wars, and it was a tactic that was known at the time, was to have your infantry form square, deploy on 4 sides with fixed bayonets. You've probably seen pictures of that, maybe of the Battle of Waterloo or something. It was done frequently in Europe. It wasn't done in America, but it was known. Buford, if he had known, he was an experienced Continental officer, should have known, but he didn't do that either. So he basically made every possible mistake he could have under the circumstances. So another thing I looked at, and at the time of the book, I had found more than 24 pension applications from Americans who fought at the Waxhaws. I probably found double that now, and the evidence is always the same. They often state that they were wounded in the battle. Sometimes they list multiple wounds, but I've never found an American participant's pension application stating that he was wounded while trying to surrender or after the fighting was over. Not one has said that. You'd think they might want to, if only to gain a little sympathy. But not one person mentioned that. Now, there was North Carolina militia nearby, and some of them will say how they learned of the massacre, but they weren't there. They're getting this secondhand somehow, which indicates the story circulated quickly. And I think there was, if we don't want to say a massacre, we can say somewhat of an atrocity a little bit, because Tarleton, who was leading the charge on the left flank, had his horse shot from under him. He was pinned on the ground. And some of his troops who saw it thought that he had been killed, and been killed unnecessarily because the Americans should have surrendered. Tarleton later wrote in his memoirs, which was closer to the actual time of the battle, 7 years afterwards, he said that the troops who thought he had been killed acted with a vindictive asperity not easily restrained. They're trying to avenge their commander on the enemy. And this leads me to believe that on the left of the battle, on the British left, the American right, that some of these British troops probably killed and wounded people who were trying to surrender or trying to escape as retaliation for the loss of Tarleton. His men really admired him, and the Legion never really fought well when he wasn't there. So that is probably what happened. I'm willing to accept that, but we're talking, a very limited. And Tarleton said it's not easy to restrain him, but he did, get up from under his horse and restrain them. So clearly, a few people were killed unnecessarily, and that's an atrocity, but it's not a systematic massacre. And we don't have Tarleton encouraging it or condoning it. We have him restraining it, which, as he said, took time. It wasn't easy to do. So this did happen. And then again, he immediately began summoning doctors from all over to do this. My battery is getting low, so I'm going to have to plug in the computer. Sorry about that. It's fully,
All right.
fully charged. Old battery doesn't last as long as it used to. So, as I said, this is a limited atrocity, not a massacre. Some Americans were certainly killed. There were no irregularities reported on the British right. I would not expect the veteran troops, British regulars of the 17th Light Dragoons, to have committed any atrocities. We do have to remember that you've got these cavalry charging into a line of infantry. It's a complete chaos at this point. You've got people throwing down their weapons, maybe trying to surrender, others continuing to fight. You've got cavalrymen still outnumbered, slashing in all directions. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos. So there could have been, some other people wounded when trying to surrender or even killed in the chaos. But again, this is just a result of the conditions as far as the rest of it goes. What about the surrender flag? I've given that some thought. Whoever carried it, it was not Bauer or Crute, because their accounts don't match anything that we know. In this era, as I pointed out earlier, commanders usually took position at the center rear of their force. So I suspect if Buford sent out, which he did, he sent out his person with the flag of truce, that's where they would go. And if that person did, he would have encountered either Captain David Corbett of the 17th Light Dragoons or Captain Thomas Kinloch of the British Legion. They're not the commander. They don't have the authority to accept a surrender. So, yes, they would have rejected the flag, maybe not outright in the confusion, but maybe saying, hey, we can't do this. Go find Tarleton. You might be over there. You might be on the other side. Tarleton, by that time, was or would soon be pinned under his horse. So if you're carrying a flag out there just as this battle is getting underway, this very rapid battle, 5 or 10 minutes of mayhem and chaos, I don't think you're going to start running around trying to see if you can find who's the proper person to deliver the flag to. You go back to Buford and say, hey, they refused it. They weren't very polite about it, and which they probably wouldn't be if they're directing their men going into battle. But when you have two people who tell a story and neither of them played the role or experienced conditions that we know were there, the testimony is not too good. So my conjecture is the person with the white flag went to the British center. These people couldn't accept the flag, so they sent them somewhere. And even if they said, go find Tarleton, maybe he didn't hear it in the chaos of galloping horses and whatnot and shouts, and probably just thought maybe they told him just to go back. So that's probably what happened. But if there was no massacre, why is the story so popular? Well, the southern states were occupied or on the verge of being overrun by the British, certainly needed a morale boost. The Americans were very, very good at using propaganda to demonize British loyalists, Indians, African Americans who were assisting with the British. Give you another example of the story, and it did happen. Jane McCrae in the Saratoga campaign, she's going to meet her loyalist fiance, and she's killed by these two Mohawk Indians who are with Burgoyne. The minute Horatio Gates got that, he wrote it up and had it sent to all the papers. And Robert G. Parkinson has done some good work on how the Continental Congress, the leading revolutionaries, used stories like this about African Americans serving with the British, about savage Indians assisting the British, about the Hessian cruel mercenaries assisting the British, as deliberate means of encouraging opposition to the British. And this becomes a ready-made piece of propaganda. Just look at the figures. We know about the effect because one South Carolina militiaman wrote afterward. He and his friends were discussing at the time they heard of the battle whether they should just take the oath of allegiance to Britain and give up the fight. And Gaston got the news of what he called a shocking massacre, and they all changed their minds and vowed to fight on without surrendering. So we actually have evidence from Gaston and his friends that this did have the desired effect of encouraging resistance. So we have that. And so that is it. If you have any questions, I will be glad to answer them.
No, that was great, Jim. And I'm going to let Mark ask questions because I want to sell Mark out here. Mark and I debate all the time about Waxhaws. And right before you jumped on with us, I was talking about, I was on board with the idea of the massacre until I read your book. And for those watching, you should get it because Jim does a great job. You show the pension statements, you show some of these primary source material, but you put those primary source materials in context when they're written, which is very important, as you pointed out. So I know Mark wasn't sold before we chatted with you. Maybe Mark is sold now, but I'll let Mark ask his questions.
Sure.
No, I think this is a great, first of all, it's a great topic to look at. Yes, since I was a kid, this event, it still is often referred to as a massacre. In the movie The Patriot, they even talk about, there's a group of Virginia Continentals who surrendered and they were all cut down, referring to this Waxhaws event. So it's and as you mentioned, I think you detailed pretty well that this is something that kind of has grown and become well known as the site of a massacre. I think it's great to, as Rob mentioned, look back at it, from contemporary accounts and then later accounts, and then trying to parse between all these different contradictory accounts. It's to find out what really happened. And yeah, usually when me and Rob are debating Waxhaws, the casualty figures are just, when you look at 5 Americans killed or 5 British killed versus, 113 Americans killed, I have to think, something was happening there and I think you are parsing it pretty well when you're saying that, there was some sort of atrocity that happened, but to using a term like massacre, I think does kind of make you think that, often I talk, we study the Texas Revolution, you hear about the Goliad massacre where they just kind of gathered up a bunch of the Texans unarmed and then just shot them down. Like that's a massacre. This is I think it reminds me that we should still be calling it a battle because there was conflict, and as you detail Buford's actions, I think it makes it as Moultrie pointed out, he's making lots of mistakes, but there was some resistance, but yeah, I think when I look at those casualty figures, this was not just a standard Revolutionary War battle. So,
well, I think if we compare them with, say, the casualties when Tarleton hits the Continental Dragoons at Monk's Corner and Lanús Ferry, they're pretty disproportionate as well, because they have the element of surprise. They have, and they come in and just start attacking before anybody could put up an effective resistance. But they aren't that disproportionate, those 2 engagements. But other engagements we see really disproportionate too, even without cavalry, like Kings Mountain.
True. I know in studying other battles, like for instance, at the Battle of Princeton, I know that when the British, which the 17th, it was the 17th Regiment of Foot, not the Dragoons, but before they go in, they are talking about not giving any sort of quarter to any sort of and there's plenty of accounts of similar things happening. And you look at the casualties, and it's whenever I see killed and wounded at around the same, it seems often rare, because I feel like in many of the battles you're going to have 3 times more wounded than actually killed. And looking at those casualties you posted, 150 wounded to 113 killed is, it's not as apparent as, if it was just a systematic massacre. But like I said, I think by calling it, at least irregularities or an atrocity at some point, I think there's something going on there. And, you also mentioned it's not mentioned a lot in many of the contemporary resources. But a lot of what I've read about the war in the South, it was, as you mentioned, at Lanúd's Ferry or other places. I mean, it's brutal combat everywhere. So it might not even have been worth mentioning that, a few of the surrendering guys were dispatched. But
yeah, and I've noticed one thing before I forget, because you mentioned Buford as well. And when Buford got back to Virginia, he stays in Continental service. But even when Cornwallis subsequently invades Virginia in early 1781, Buford, after Waxhaws, never again commands troops in the field. So clearly there's this unspoken, this guy may be a veteran colonel with many years of service, but we are not putting him in command of any of our troops again after this. Another point I noticed, actually, I hadn't really paid attention to it until recently. I just finished up a book on the South Carolina provincial troops, and the South Carolina Royalist Regiment was mounted in 1781 and served as cavalry, and they were in numerous cavalry actions. And there was one cavalry action that didn't actually involve them, but that depleted much of the advantage the British got from mounting them, where Lee's Legion engaged a British cavalry unit and killed a handful and wounded a handful and took 40 prisoners with no losses. And you see some of these actions, these cavalry actions between the provincial troops on the British side and the American troops, sometimes militia, sometimes state troops, sometimes continental. And there are just these numerous occasions where the casualties are 35 to 1, 30 to none, and they can switch from one side to the other depending on who gets the advantage. But there is, as Moultrie noted, that does often tend to be disproportionate casualties when cavalry is involved in these actions, and one gets the advantage over the other quickly.
Jim, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning, talking about what Buford, the battle started. What do you think? I mean, what was his plan? When he denies Tarleton's offer, his original offer for the terms of surrender. I mean, is he just trying to get his way as fast as possible, or do he think he could turn and make a stand, or what do you think is going through his head? Was there anything in that letter that you found that kind of highlighted what was going on in his mind at that time?
Nothing that explicitly states it. He probably couldn't have outrun. I think he realized he couldn't have outrun Tarleton's cavalry with his baggage train unless he wanted to abandon that, which he could have, and obstructed the road in some of the surrounding area. But I think he realized he couldn't escape, but he probably thought that he could defeat the force that was after him, or at least hold them off until such time as he could get underway again, maybe nightfall. He obviously hadn't been marching fast since on his retreat, but he must have figured, well, if they catch up with me, I can hold them off, because he did have a fairly strong force, even if he didn't use it effectively.
I think too, in the last couple of slides, I think the most amazing thing about the Waxhaws is not just the fighting, but there's, like you said, the continental propaganda machine afterwards. It takes off pretty quick, as you know. Like, it's pretty amazing to think in the 18th century, without social media, that this was able to pervade throughout, the southern colonies as a rallying call for continental leaders to keep militia units on the field and to rally more people to the cause. It's just amazing to me, even today, reading your book and reading about all this, how quickly and how well they were able to take this story and turn it so quickly into a positive for themselves. Was there anyone that was like leading that effort, or was it just some kind of homegrown movement?
It seems to be more, to use your term, a homegrown movement, spreading by word of mouth. To the units nearby, and then to others. The oral transmission of news was pretty fascinating in that era. There's an interesting account that John Adams wrote, left from a meeting he had with two of Georgia's delegates to the Second Continental Congress. And we know that enslaved people were generally not literate because they were denied that opportunity. They were also supposedly restricted to their plantations without a pass. But the two Georgia delegates told John Adams in Philadelphia that if the British landed a force in Georgia with 10,000, I think was the number, stand of arms and uniforms, and offered to arm all of the enslaved people who would join them, that the word would spread, as they put it, in a fortnight throughout Georgia and South Carolina. 2 weeks. They believed every slave would know about it and come pouring into the British. And these are people who don't have the advantage of print to circulate their news and who aren't technically supposed to leave their plantations without permission. But these Georgians know that the word gets through, and it has to travel just as fast through people who can move around freely, who are literate. Certainly the Charleston press, as well as the Georgia press at the time, is in the hands of the British. But you still have newspapers in other states. You have people giving their reports, telling their accounts, and it just circulates. There's much more, I think, person-to-person contact. Then you've got these militia units, this North Carolina militia unit that's not far from the Waxhaws, and some of the survivors come in with their horror tales, and these men then go back home and spread it, to their homes, families, neighbors. And it does get around surprisingly quickly without having to post it online.
Other than your book, can you recommend any other places for people to get more information about Waxhaws that you find interesting and credible?
Nobody has yet done any kind of book or article length study since this. Mm-hmm. Some people, as I've noticed, when reading their, say, accounts of the Southern campaign that have come out since, tend to, if they don't reject the Massacre account entirely, they treat it with more skepticism than they used to. But there really isn't anything at this point that addresses the battle specifically, or the atrocity / massacre debate specifically at this point.
Well, hopefully with the 250th commemoration and some of the work that you all are doing in South Carolina to preserve Waxhaws and the Liberty Trail and all the work going on in Camden, other places, there'll be more of a focus on some new research and some more attention to these, especially to Waxhaws, because like you said, you take a whole different approach to it than other books I've taken previously. So I'm thinking hopefully as we get close to the commemoration, we'll find more people interested and find some more people that would be willing to research it.
What I see on this picture, some of the site today. Now, me and Rob, we've been stopped by there and saw the mass grave. Is there? Can you tell us anything about the battlefield site and any of the, if you know it, any sort of plans to interpret this engagement on the site?
Yeah, several years ago, the South Carolina state government, through I think it was the Department of Highways or something, put up some new interpretive markers that reflect, some of what I went over today regarding the massacre. The American Battlefield Trust has been acquiring a lot of property down here, and I understand they've acquired some portion of the Waxhaws battlefield with a plan to improve the interpretation. So that should help. I mean, as I mentioned, it wasn't a long battle. We're talking really just a few minutes of contact and cavalrymen's riding through and over the infantry and then wheeling and sabers swinging and Continentals trying to reload and light infantry surging forward with bayonets and people running, yelling, a lot of confusion. But I think it can be interpreted, as you saw earlier. We did those maps, which are still fairly accurate, and, except for, as I said, we didn't have anybody on the west of the road for the Americans. But we now know, the archaeological studies have helped. So I think it could make a good, interpretive site with it, and it's something that people can explore in a relatively short amount of time because it's not a big field like some of these parks that are so extensive. So I hope that will continue to move forward with the interpretation.
Yeah, I've been there several times, and the last time I was there, some of those new signs you mentioned were up. You can see there's a lot of changes going on based on the research, and like you said, the APT, American Battlefield Trust, has done with a lot of the partners down there, have done a lot of work on preserving the land down there, and I think hopefully you'll see that grow, and like you said, more trails and some more interpretation.
And
so
there's
Jim, go ahead.
There's a mass grave there of the
Mm-hmm.
some of the Continentals who died, which is worthy of stopping and paying respects. As you mentioned, I mean, I can only imagine what kind of terrifying few minutes that battle must have been. But
yeah.
So, Jim, before we wrap up here, can you share any of your new projects you're working on right now? I know you mentioned your South Carolina Provincials book, and I know you've mentioned that to me before, but can you share with our viewers anything you're working on right now that they can take a look for?
Yeah, the South Carolina Provincials book should be out this summer, and it's called South Carolina Provincials. And it is a history of the South Carolina Royalist Regiment, beginning with its origins as loyalist militia who first besieged revolutionary supporters at the town of 96 in the backcountry. They subsequently were demobilized by their commanders, and then the revolutionary militia came through and arrested a lot of the leaders. But people like Joseph Robinson, Ewan McLaren made their way to the British colonies in what were then East and West Florida, finally getting to St. Augustine in East Florida, and then were joined by hundreds of South Carolina Loyalist refugees in the spring of 1778, and then incorporated into this regiment that served throughout the war. They particularly distinguished themselves during the Allied attack, the French and American attack on Savannah in October 1779, so much so that the redoubt they helped to defend was later often called the Carolina Redoubt because of the staunch defense they put up there. They were joined in June of 1780 by a unit that never achieved full strength. The South Carolina Rangers. John Harrison had joined the British in Georgia. He was from the region east of Camden along Lynch's River. And after the fall of Charleston, Cornwallis gave him permission to recruit a Ranger regiment with the rank of major. He probably recruited, Cornwallis certainly believed that, as he testified afterwards, about 300 men total in the course of the war, but seldom had more than 100 in the field at any one time. But they were pretty valuable auxiliaries with the British in their anti-partisan operations. And then there were 3 troops of provincial light dragoons created in 1781 to help provide for the lack of cavalry. So I discuss all of these units. I've got another book which I actually am dealing with the page proofs, just starting to now. It's called 7 Myths of the American Revolution, and it's being published by Hackett in Massachusetts. It's intended primarily as a textbook, but it is written to be accessible to anyone. So One of the publisher's goals and my goals and the other contributors was that it not, be dry like a textbook, but we deal with various myths, actually more than 7 myths. Some chapters deal with multiple myths when it's appropriate. And that should be out sometime this summer as well. And other than that, I've been working with the state of South Carolina's 250th anniversary commission on various projects, as well as with Historic Camden Foundation. So I'm kept fairly busy.
I was going to say that's a lot. Mark and I struggle to get our books out when they're half the size of the ones you're writing. So, so high respect for what you do, sir.
Well, thank you.
Well, thanks again, Jim. For those watching, please check out Jim's works. You can go to Amazon. Definitely check out Bloody Be Upon Your Head. It's an excellent book about Waxhaws. You can still find it. It's great research. And Jim, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, I would point out the Blood Be Upon Your Head is not on Amazon.
Okay.
Right now, my other books are. What happened with that one? The first printing sold out.
That's good.
And then it was a while before the second printing was done, and we have tried to get it back on Amazon, and for some reason it seems to be more difficult to get it back on, but it is available through Southern Campaign.org.
Yeah.
They have a system for that, since it was published through them, or people can contact me, and I've got copies that I can provide if they'd like.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that, because I always like to support local booksellers more than Amazon. So southerncampaign.org is probably the best place to go. I like that idea. So, but thanks again, Jim. And like I said, we'll talk soon. Take care, everyone. And we'll see you in 2 more weeks.